Hi, can you hear me?
We can, and I'd just like to confirm that we are also recording because these go out on YouTube afterwards. So we'll look forward to welcoming our virtual attendees online as well. Over to you, Mary.
Brilliant. Let me just then share my screen so we have the PowerPoint running. Sorry, it's just Microsoft Teams has decided to be a little bit slow, as it often does when you wanted to do something.
We're all getting used to this now, aren't we?
Yeah, it just takes a minute to load sometimes.
Here we go.
Let's put it into presenter. Great. So is that showing just as a slide now? Perfect.
That's great. Thanks, Mary. I'll leave you to it.
Great. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me today. I thought I'd start with a really brief introduction just about what I study and where I did uni and all of that, so you kind of can see my path as to how I got to this topic. So I studied Spanish and Latin American studies at UCL for my undergraduate degree. So I grew up in Edinburgh, moved to London for that. And during my undergraduate degree, because I did a language, I had to do a year abroad. And for my year abroad, I went to Chile and lived in Santiago for a year. And I studied at a university there. And I studied political science and a little bit of history while I was there. And when I finished at UCL, finished my undergraduate, I went and did an MPhil at Cambridge in Latin American studies. And I did that for about 2 years. And that was focused more on Chilean politics, very modern poli-sci. And then I ended up deciding that I wanted to do colonial literature. So I came here for a master's to Oxford. And that's where I met my supervisor, who I work with, and I stayed on. So I'm now in the second year of my PhD with that supervisor. And I do the literature of the very first 100 years in which the Spanish Empire was in Chile. And I look at the 5 senses, so how they were understood medically, and then how they were written about and how they were used by these writers. So let me just start with a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking to you about today. I want to begin with just a brief description of the indigenous people in Chile, both at the period in which the Spanish came and in the modern day. I then want to look at the failures of 2 conquistadors, so that's kind of soldiers in the Spanish Empire who attempted to conquer Chile. And then I'm going to look at the Arauco War, which began between the Spanish Empire and the indigenous people of Chile. Then we're going to move and look a bit more at what I study, which are accounts of this war. And we're going to look at some of the major ones, why they were written, what they're talking about. And then I'm going to give you 2 brief examples of some of the kind of things that I look at. So that's from 2 chapters, one which is sound, so the sense of sound, and one which is about the sense of taste. So hopefully you'll kind of see not only perhaps a new area of research. I know this isn't part of the A-level curriculum, or it wasn't part of the curriculum in Scotland for me. So you'll get to see a little bit extra, but you also get to see practically like what we do in a language department and the kind of research you can do. So I want to start by looking at the indigenous people of Chile. Let's go to, there we go. So before we talk about the Spanish Empire, I just want to begin with the people who are really the heart of today's story. The main indigenous group in Chile before the Spanish arrived were called the Reche, R-E-C-H-E, and that's what they referred to themselves as. So that's the term I'm going to be using for them specifically. And that's actually what we might call a macro ethnic group. So that's a group made up of lots of smaller groups, but who share a language and major customs. and their territory was called Mapu. And you can see on the PowerPoint, I've just put a map there of what their territory was when just before the Spanish arrived. And this was actually produced by Indigenous geographers who are working with their elders to understand not only what the territory was, but how they viewed it. So this is modern day Chile and Argentina, but you'll notice the orientation is slightly different. And the borders are really linked to the rivers. And this was how, and still how, the Indigenous people of Chile understand. So if you look at the little top corner, you can see that it's kind of a slither of the southern part of South America, but we've just turned it. So east is upward. Traditionally, their land runs from sea to sea, and then you've got the Andes separating Chile and Argentina. And you can see that this is just a massive amount of land. And these were made up of different groups, but again, with one kind of shared, somewhat mutually intelligible language called Mapudungun. And the Mapuche were incredibly well organized when it came to warfare specifically. They generally lived in kind of clans, but in times of war, they sent representatives from each clan to a major meeting of all the Reche. And in this meeting, they would appoint someone to lead the meeting, and then this person would lead a selection from among all the representatives of a war chieftain who would lead the united clans against their enemy in specifically times of war. But in peace, they didn't have this united system at all. And this system was incredibly, incredibly successful. And at the end of the 15th century, just before the Spanish arrived, the Reche managed to fight off the powerful Inca Empire. So they would be on this map, just off onto the left-hand side. They took over vast swathes of what's now Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, but they were stopped coming into Chile. And on the right-hand side, you have a representation of a big battle between the Inca and the Mapuche from indigenous Peruvian source from the period, which basically shows the Inca being beaten. Sorry, just trying to get the next slide. There we go. So the modern day Mapuche, who are the ancestors of the Reche, and Mapuche is now the word they use to describe themselves, have just 5% of their original territory left. So they're a minority, and they have a very small part right in the south of Chile. This is their flag, as you can see in the picture on the screen, and this is from repeated protests. They are constantly in a state of conflict with the Chilean government, mainly because there's a lot of issues with loggers and miners coming into their territory still. And so it's a very kind of difficult situation right now, and something that there's a lot of academic work on if you look in political science. So it's interesting to just see how essentially this conflict begins and is still going on today very much. So I want to just briefly look at the early conquistadors who came to Chile. So the two cases we might know a little bit about in terms of the history of Spanish Empire are Mexico and Peru. So Columbus comes originally to the Caribbean in 1492, and it's only about 1519 that Hernán Cortés comes and takes over what's sometimes known as the Aztec Empire. And then about 10 years later, you have Francisco Pizarro, who comes down to Peru and takes over the Inca Empire. And it's from Peru then that the Spanish begin to want to extend their territory because they just want more land. They hand out parcels of land as essentially rewards to people, and they need more rewards. They want to take over as much as possible, and they've heard about there being very fertile lands to the south of Peru. So we have this figure, and this is the first massive failure of the Spanish Empire, and it's led by Diego de Almagro. And in 1535, he was granted some rights to the land in Chile, despite the Spanish never having been there. They said, yes, this is yours if you go claim them. So he left with a group of soldiers, a group of Inca indigenous people who were kind of coming along, and also a lot of enslaved Africans who they were using. And they went in this massive band of about, I think in total, 5,000 people. And when he left in 1535, he left in about June. But you have to remember this is Southern Hemisphere, so that's the middle of winter. And there were two routes from Peru to Chile. The first is over the Andes. And Diego de Almagro was warned repeatedly by the Inca in his group not to take the route over the Andes in the winter. And I've included just a little snapshot from the Lord of the Rings movie when they're crossing to kind of give you a sense of what it's like crossing the Andes during the winter. So if you look at the map, the smaller map on the right, what you'll see is that they were essentially going right through the middle of the tallest part of the Andes. So where the mountains are up to 7,000 meters in elevation. And they did this in the middle of winter. And as a result, groups of men and their horses literally froze solid. And we know this because later groups who also made this decision found and then had to eat the frozen bodies. And in fact, many of the enslaved Africans he brought with him died in this particular part of the mission. He then gets to Chile and he starts fighting with a lot of Reche, and they beat him quite squarely. Every time he tries to put a settlement down, they just destroy him. And after a year or so, he claims that he's conquered it, but that hasn't really happened. So he decides he needs to go back to Lima. So he's been warned off of taking the route back through the Andes. So he decides to take the other route, which is the coastal route. And it's now December, January-ish, but in the Southern Hemisphere, that is summer. And so Diego de Almagro goes up through the Atacama Desert, which is the driest place on Earth and the driest non-polar desert. And he goes through the middle of summer and they lose a ton more men. So essentially, by the time the first expedition to Chile gets back, they're described as arriving into Cusco in literal rags that are hanging from their emaciated bodies. They barely survive, but nevertheless, the Spanish Empire has apparently conquered Chile. So after that, they decide they need to go back, and they send another person who is currently living in Peru, which was the conquistador PEDRO de Valdivia, and he's sent down, and he works really hard to try and trade a bit more with the Reche, to try and establish farms, and founds the city of Santiago in 1551. But essentially, these are repeatedly destroyed by the Reche. Anytime the Spanish have a settlement, it's burned down. The Reche even resort to burning their own crops so that the Spanish can't steal them. And on Christmas Day of 1553, there is the Battle of Tucapel, which the Spanish lose terribly. And Pedro de Valdivia is taken captive and immediately killed. And there are lots of different kind of accounts which try and describe how he was killed. We don't exactly know. But essentially, despite his efforts to trade and whatever, it was still a massive failure for the Spanish Empire. And so I kind of want to ask the question, and we won't do so because this is just being recorded and not live, but what the difference is then between conquest or invasion. And this was actually a really interesting question that was asked in a talk I attended just this year, back in November, in which a historian, more of kind of Mesoamerica, suggested that perhaps instead of calling it the conquest of Spanish America, we think about it as an invasion. And we think about the idea of all these people being quite settled and then the Spanish Empire just turning up. We would view that as an invasion. And that's something that I've tried to incorporate more and more in my scholarship. And to me, just represents one of the really interesting things you do, both in university and as an undergrad, but also as a postgrad, which is constantly having kind of things that you assume and just use challenged and really having to think about what you mean. And it's something that I really enjoy. So I'd try and view the Spanish arriving to Chile as an invasion. They invaded Wallmapu. And when they invaded Wallmapu, what happened was the Arauco War. And this is one of the focuses of my academic work, but also a lot of the outreach I do, which is basically to tell as many people as possible about this war, because I really believe it's one of the most important wars in history that no one has heard of. And I include some people in the field that do Spanish history. It's just not spoken about. But the Arauco War is really important to the history of both the Spanish Empire and colonialism for two reasons. The first is that it's one of the longest wars in history. And I'm going to show you, this is my favorite screenshot, and that's the screenshot of historiographic divergence, which is actually just from the Wikipedia for the Arauco War. And you can see basically that historians have no idea when it ended. And I stand with a different camp, which suggests that the Arauco War is very much still ongoing and has never ended, making it a nearly 500-year-old conflict because of the conditions of the modern-day Mapuche. And the reason there's a lot of this digression is because the war goes through different stages. So the kind of all-out field battles that you think of as really typical kind of warfare, those did end in perhaps 1662 or 1656, as Wikipedia suggests. But they were still fighting, and there were different forms of warfare way up until after Chile got its independence from Spain, so 1811, 1821. And then even through to the modern day, you're still having armed conflict. So very long war. The other reason it's so important is that it's really one of the only wars in which a European empire lost to indigenous people. And the first several centuries of the history of the Arauco War is the Spanish losing and losing terribly. They are constantly having their frontiers pushed back. Santiago, the capital and the capital today, is destroyed so much that there are barely any colonial buildings standing if you go to the modern day city, because they were just burnt down. So it's really important in understanding how empires fail, and being aware that they did fail and how they dealt with it. Spain was incredibly embarrassed by the result of it. So as a kind of part of that, you don't hear it spoken about. Part of countering that then is to talk about the war. So what I study are accounts of this war. And I really want to clarify that we don't have any sources written by the Reche, either in their indigenous language of Mapudungun or in Spanish. And we have a lot of indigenous accounts of the invasions of Peru and Mexico. Because of the nature of those invasions, they would quickly establish schools and universities into which indigenous peoples went. They were taught the Spanish writing system or given a written version of their language, and they produced their own accounts. Because of the war, we don't have that in Chile. The first university isn't there until really the 1800s. So we only have Spanish accounts, unfortunately. We have quite a limited number of these accounts. And for the historians among you, you're going to realize very quickly that they look very different to what you might be used to. One of the things I really enjoy is that the accounts are neither literature nor history. They fall somewhere in between, and they're somewhat aware of that. And as a scholar, I constantly have to be aware that I have no idea if something's true or not. But I also can't just say, oh, that's made up, because they were also firsthand witnessed accounts. So the most famous of these accounts is called La Araucana. And it is a very, very long epic poem. In my copy, it extends to about 800 to 1,000 pages. It's made up of 37 cantos or chapters, and those are spread across 3 volumes, which were published in 1569, 1578, and 1589/90. Its author, Alonso de Arcia, born in 1533 and died in 1594, was born in Madrid to a noble family from the Basque region. And in 1548, he became page to the heir apparent Prince Philip, who was later known as King Philip II. and his mother was lady-in-waiting for the Infanta Maria. Garcia therefore received a really privileged education at court with Prince Philip's tutors, and he would accompany Prince Philip across Europe until 1555, when Garcia went to the Americas to quell a rebellion in Peru. And he arrived in Peru in 1556, along with a guy named Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza, who had recently been named governor of Chile. And he was governor from April 1557 to February 1561. And Garcia would spend 17 months in Chile in what my supervisor often refers to as the worst gap year of all time. He immediately went to the front line and witnessed a series of major losses, the murder of many Indigenous heroes. And you have throughout his account, he kind of literally describes himself writing on scraps of paper on the battlefield. But in March of 1558, he meets this kind of old personal enemy he has called Juan de Pineda, and the two have a duel. And this duel is witnessed by the governor of Chile, who imprisons and sentences both duelists to death. This was a really unpopular decision, and people petition him a lot. And they go to the point where they actually set up the execution. They're all ready to have it that day. Everyone is thinking he's going to be killed, and finally he relents. He is exiled to Peru, imprisoned there for 3 months, and eventually Garcia makes his way back to Spain. When in Spain, he becomes quite a rich merchant. He has one son, who dies, in fact, in the Spanish Armada against the British. And Garcia, while back in Spain, then writes and publishes these 3 volumes of his time in Chile to, in his own words, shed light on this unknown conflict. And these stories become a massive hit. Everyone's reading them. Cervantes, who writes Don Quixote, describes them as one of the greatest works of all time. Wonderful book. I love this epic poem. And it's also written in very comprehensible Spanish, even for the modern day. But the problem was Hurtado, the governor of Chile, was not understandably portrayed very well in this account, because of, sentencing the author to death. And the account was really, really popular. So in the 1590s, Hurtado kind of tries to run a bit of a PR campaign. And he hires a young poet to write an alternative version of La Araucana, which celebrates himself and tells about his victories in the war. And this young poet was called Pedro de Oña. He was actually born way in southern Chile at one of the military fortresses, which was quickly destroyed. And his father was killed in the Arauco War. His mother remarries to a man with quite a lot of money and influence. And so Oña is sent to Lima, and he studies literature and humanities at 2 different universities, while also kind of going out on some campaigns before he's hired to write this poem. And the poem covers quite a lot of the same events as La Araucana, but generally is just a celebration of how wonderful the governor of Chile was throughout this time. So then we have the third of the 4 texts that I'm really interested in. And this is one that hasn't really been studied very much at all, almost not at all outside of Chile. And it was written by a soldier much later, and it is his account of trying to sway the events of the war in Chile. So it was written by someone called Alonso González de Nájera, and he was born in 1556 and died in 1561. He was born in the city of Cuenca in Spain to a family of scribes, and then he became a soldier quite young and fought in France, Flanders, and Italy before he was sent to the Americas in 1600. And he had been explicitly sent to aid the Arauco War and arrived in Chile in 1601, following what was called the disaster of Curalaba, which happened December 23rd, 1598, in which the Spanish were ambushed and lost a major war, which in fact saw their governor killed on the battlefield. And after this, you have what's called the destruction of the 7 cities, which are 7 cities that are very violently destroyed in southern Chile, and the Spanish get almost pushed out completely of Chile. So in 1607, we have all these disasters. The Spanish are massively losing. They have no men. They're short on food. Their forts are gone. And Najera is sent to Spain. And he arrives at the court in 1608. And he is an emissary of the governor, the new governor. And his job is to report to the king, Felipe III, on the situation in Chile and secure further aid. But when he arrives, the Jesuits, so one of the Catholic orders, have beaten him to it. And they have a very specific plan for how they want to fix the issues in Chile. And they invent a style of military tactics called the defensive war, in which essentially there are no more attacks. It's only defensive, and the focus becomes on trade and evangelization. And they've sent someone called Luis de Valdivia, a priest, to argue this to the court. So you have this priest versus Najera the soldier. And ultimately, Najera's arguments don't win out. His main argument being that he really wants to enslave the indigenous people, and that's going to be his amazing solution. It doesn't work out. They decide to go with a defensive war. And he is sent to Italy to become a minor governor there to kind of get rid of him. But he decides to write up all his arguments, reasons why he thinks they need to send more soldiers, more support, and enslave the indigenous. And that is finished in 1614. And it's not published until the end of the 1800s and about 1866 when it's found again. But it's a really useful source for understanding what soldiers on the ground thought about what was going on in Chile and what they wanted done. So that's one of the sources I look at. And then the final source I write about is called Cautiverio Feliz. So Francisco Núñez de Pineda was born in central Chile, like Pedro de Oña, and following 8 years of a Jesuit education, he joined the army to fight in the Arauco War, and he became a captain quite quickly in the Spanish army. And on May 15th...
Mary, sorry to interrupt. May I just interrupt very abruptly and rudely, just to ask if our guests have any questions, just to clarify that they can ask them on Slido.
Yeah.
And just to do that, you just go to slido.com, slido.com, and then I'll ask you for an event code. And if you put TBC9 in, you'll come to this event, which is called Trinity Beyond the Classroom, Talk 9. And there you can ask any questions you wish of Mary. And I'll put them to her. Sorry to interrupt, Mary. Just to repeat, that code is TBC9 on slido.com. Over to you.
No worries. So there's this big battle in 1629, and Francisco is taken captive. And he's taken captive by the Reche for 6 months. And he kind of gets released, and he apparently has quite a nice time, eats a lot of food, drinks a lot of beer. It's all fairly peaceful, and he's released by kind of agreement. There's a trade of captives. But in 1634, there's a comedy staged in Lima about his time, which makes fun of him and suggests that he has kind of an illicit affair with the daughter of one of the chieftains. So he writes this account much later in 1672, in which he describes his captivity. So those are 4 accounts I work with the most, and the ones that are kind of most interesting to me. And they're all different views of what the war was like, and they all have different political arguments about how the war should be ended. So I just want to move on quickly to 2 different ways in which I work with these accounts, so you can kind of see practically what I do day to day. So one of my projects was about the idea of speech in the Araucana. So this is part of my chapter on sound, and I decided to interpret sound through the sound of speech. So what you hear in terms of, are people shouting, are people angry, how much they speak and who speaks and to whom they speak. And for this chapter, I was really interested in ideas of race and gender. And what I did was what's called a digital humanities project. So that's an interdisciplinary methodology where we use essentially digital techniques, and this can be anything. Coding, it can just be putting stuff in an Excel sheet, it can be maps, and we use that within different fields of the humanities. And so here I counted the lines of speech, so direct speech, the stuff you find between between speech marks in the Araucana, and I've mapped it. And what we can see here, for example, is that the indigenous characters speak way, way, way more than the Spanish characters, which is a bit strange when it's ostensibly a text that's about the Spanish invasion of Chile. And this leads us into a deeper argument about essentially what was this text trying to do? There's a real big argument among scholars about whether the text celebrates empire or whether it's questioning empire. And traditionally, it's been seen as a celebration. But what I argue is that if we look at speech, we can begin to suggest that perhaps it wasn't so much of a celebration. It was critiquing and it was giving a voice to the indigenous people. And the other thing I want to talk about is something I work quite a lot on, which is the history of food in Chile. So one of the really interesting things, one of the things I like to kind of always talk about, is that chips and strawberries are not British, they're Chilean. And that's because potatoes in part originated in Chile, as did the method of frying them and cooking them like that. But also the variety of the strawberry we're going to buy in the supermarket and put cream on for Wimbledon is the Chilean variety, or at least uses the Chilean variety. And this was a key crop for indigenous peoples across Mapuche. And we can tell that because in their language, there are specific words for wild strawberries and cultivated strawberries. So we know they were farming them. And in 1542, Pedro de Valdivia wrote a letter in which he coins a new term for this specific kind of strawberry. So if you're learning Spanish, your teacher probably taught you the word fresa for strawberry, but in Chile you would call it frutilla, literally little fruit. And that was first written by Valdivia when trying to describe what they were. And the strawberries appear in almost every single account of the War of Chile. And they're really interestingly used, often to try and make arguments about the war. So in that text I mentioned that's arguing for the enslavement of the indigenous people, he actually uses strawberries to try and suggest that they should be enslaved by saying, essentially, their land is so fertile and it grows this amazing fruit, we should take it. And so it's really tied up in just the history of empire. And that's one of the things I find very interesting, is taking kind of common things that we don't really think about and tracing their history back and like forcing us to rethink some of the assumptions we might have about those items. So that's just a brief overview of what I do, what I study, and what kind of my research looks like. If you have any questions about anything I've asked, you're interested in a bit more about it or how I came to do it, then my email is just up on the screen, and I'm always happy to have emails from students, happy to send you book recommendations about any aspect of colonial history or even Spanish. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Mary. And it's also worth mentioning, if anybody would like to put in another question on Slido, I can see the Slido panel. 2 questions have come in.
Yeah.
Firstly, Mary, this is nice. What languages did you study at school?
Yeah, so at school I studied Spanish, classical Greek, and Mandarin Chinese. I was very bad at Mandarin Chinese, and I was very bad at classical Greek. I liked Spanish, but I preferred English and history. So I very much view Spanish as a tool, and that's what I did in university. But I enjoyed the cultural literary classes more than I did learning the grammar and everything.
Wow, that's an impressive collection of languages, isn't it? It's not everybody who has the opportunity to do a bit of classical Greek. That's amazing.
Yeah, we went to a very pro-language school. So.
And I guess actually learning any language helps you in your learning of another, doesn't it? I would imagine.
100%. Once you've learned one, the next ones you can pick up a lot faster, because you also understand how you learn. So if I want to learn, like I've done Portuguese and Quechua, an indigenous language since, and it's much easier because I know how I tend to learn languages. So instead of having to sit through a long time, I kind of know, oh, okay, I need to learn the verb conjugation instead of kind of having to start back at what is a verb.
And another lovely question. Sorry, very, very quickly, where do you think you'll take your research from here? Are you likely to carry on teaching and researching in the uni or go into another field?
Yes, so I'm hoping to stay an academic. I do teach right now. I teach modern Latin American literature and also Latin American literature, but from colonial Mexico. And I'm going to start teaching translation next year as well. Hopefully I'll stay in academia. I'd love to write more about the senses as they relate to conquest. It was a time when we had really different understandings of what the senses were. And I like seeing how kind of contact with the indigenous people changed what the Spanish understood about the senses, essentially.
Wow, that's going way beyond languages then, isn't it? It's a understanding of humanities and our understanding of the world, absolutely.
It gets very, and I use the word in the thing, but like it always is worth explaining, interdisciplinary. So although I studied Spanish, you don't end up having to do just language. You're not going to just have to write about grammar or a certain book for the rest of your life. Even if you stay in the Spanish department, you can do history, do a bit of anthropology, you can do art, kind of anything you want. There's so much room in the space to explore what you're interested in. I did Spanish because I was specifically interested in Latin America. And so it let me do just anything I wanted to do in Latin America, which is often a mix of different things.
And of course, they're not just add-ons as well. They
No,
understand, they help you understanding of the whole culture, don't they? They're part of the language, arguably the humanities bits of it.
Yeah, and I also think the world isn't divided into kind of subject categories. Yes, you have to choose one for university, but most of the questions you might have and most of the things that happen in the world don't fit neatly into history, literature, anthropology. And so it makes sense that we would have to draw on a lot of things. And to be honest, I didn't do that much colonial literature history in my undergraduate degree because there wasn't that much available at the time. I took what I could, but that was only a couple classes. So most of this has come from kind of super curricular reading and interest that then I ended up focusing more on.
And tonight's talk's been a fantastic example of that super curricular. I mean, in terms of a deep dive into a very specific field, but also just to come back a bit, really, a sense of learning a language is not just a linguistic thing. It's a wholly cultural, historical, and sort of totally humanitarian absorption in the whole society, isn't it? Mary, you've been a fantastic exponent of that tonight. Thank you very much for your talk, and thank you to our guests for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheerio. Goodbye.